So my name is Moira Weir, and on behalf of Collaboration for Impact, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is part of a series that we're doing on collaborating in changing times, and we're thrilled to have you all here. I'd like to acknowledge that always has, always will be Aboriginal land, and we particularly recognise that Collaboration for Impact, elders past, present and emerging leaders, and recognising that the land has never been ceded. We're going to have a really fabulous conversation today that will be led by Liz Skelton, and she'll be joined by Mark Steers and Jane Hunt, and they'll be introduced to us shortly. I do have a deeply heartfelt apology from Carolyn Curtis from the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, who can't join us today due to a family illness, but she does send all her very best wishes to you all for a fruitful, engaging and thought-provoking conversation. We'll be having a few technical things that I'd like to address. If you want to talk to each other in the chat, please use the chat function to do that. There is a Q&A, that's two little speech bubbles that you can see. If you've got a particular question that you would like to ask to one of the panellists, please put that in there as well, and I'll keep an eye on that to support the panel today and Liz. And pop yourself on probably speaker or gallery view, whichever one depending on how you want to see. Even though we can't see all of you, we know that you are there. So you can help us feel the love that you're bringing to us too by conversing in the chat and telling us who you are, where you are, and if you've got a question emerging. So I'm going to hand over to Liz Skelton as your host for this webinar. And Liz is well known to many of you on the call. If I looked at the registration list, and there are many friends amongst us, so it's great to have you there. Liz is one of the co-founders and a director of Collaboration for Impact, and you'll all be familiar with her work as a leader and an expert, and has expertise in consulting and facilitation, particularly around systems change, and has accumulated this wisdom and experience both here in Australia and also in the UK. So I'm going to give you over to Liz, and I'll be hiding in the background here, keeping an eye on the chat in case there's questions and things you'd like to ask as well. So over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Moira, and hello everybody. Welcome to what I think is number 5 in the series that we've had around looking at what does it mean to collaborate in changing and complex times. I'm joining you today from Gadigal country in Newtown in Sydney, and just acknowledging all the different country that you're all on today. Wonderful to be joined today by 2 fantastic colleagues, Jane Hunt at the Front Project and Mark from Sydney Policy Lab, and I'll hand over to them in a second to introduce themselves. I just want to spend a few minutes framing up what we're going to be focusing on today, which is really unpacking from the role of intermediaries. What is it that we're seeing as intermediaries in these complex changing times we're in, with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, with the massive disruption that's going on, and how are we as intermediaries responding, but what are we seeing out there, and what are some of the patterns that we can form? But I just want to say a wee bit about what do we mean by an intermediary. So this is an emerging kind of dialogue that's come into the lexicon lately, and I think that we'll probably be hearing more of it as we are working in systems change. The role of the intermediaries seems to be becoming more prominent and more talked about, at least, even if it's not prominent. So we're talking about intermediaries really as a specialist, capability specialist often, who are supporting people who are trying to lead complex change around issues such as disadvantage, poverty, whatever it might be, to enable the sectors or enable the field to be able to come together and make change. So recently what's emerged is, if you like, framing about different types of intermediaries. There's many different ones that we see out there. Many of our partners internationally, people like Tamarack in Canada, FSG in the US, are intermediaries to support collective impact initiatives, but to also support community-led population level change. And there's many in Australia, But what we found is quite a useful framing that comes out of Bridgespan in the US, which is another intermediary, is 4 different types of intermediaries. And they're framed as a field catalyst, which is where the entity might deploy different capabilities to try and influence the field. And they're doing that usually fairly quietly, but they're supporting what's happening in the sector, trying to get population level change. There's also capability specialists, people who bring a specialism such as systems change or a particular intervention and skill that they're bringing forward, like design thinking, whatever it might be. And it could be that you straddle a number of different types as well. I think CFI would call itself a field catalyst, but also a capability specialist in how to address complexity and systems change. And then we have evidence action labs, which are really a research and development focus on advising policymakers and helping those in the field learn and improve about what does change look like. And the 4th framing is a place-based backbone, which those of you who are involved in collective impact initiatives will be really familiar with, which is an initiative that coordinates at a local or regional level, and they coordinate multiple collaborations to get a sector-wide response, and they help them learn into that. So that framing is quite useful, but I think what we all generally agree on is that the focus of intermediaries has changed recently from being both a capacity strengthening role, but also to be extending to playing a role in actually galvanizing change and playing an active role in galvanizing change, maybe on working on 1 or 2 conditions. And certainly the work we're doing at CFI, we would say the conditions we work on are around how do we help the field move from programmatic responses to systemic responses and build the capacity, and also focus on the impact of colonisation and collaboration across First Nations and other Australians. So we thought that framing might be useful to think about the different types of intermediaries before we delve into, you know, what are we seeing? So I'm now going to flick over, and Jane, I'll start with you could you talk about what does the Front Project do? What kind of intermediary role would you say you're taking?
Thank you, Liz, and it is wonderful to join you all today. I'm sitting on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, so in Victoria. So also wanted to acknowledge that Victoria is going through a difficult time at the moment, and we've had record cases and things like that. So just want to extend for all of the Victorians out there, we can absolutely do this and get through it. But I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that, because that is the backdrop of our work at the moment. And in fact, what I'm seeing is emerging differences in Australia around how we're all needing to cope with COVID as it imposes itself on our lives. But we work at the Front Project on the early childhood education system. And so we're very much looking at how do we decrease the amount of vulnerability that developmental vulnerability that children have, and how do we create a system, an early childhood education system that is equitable, has good access, and is really high quality, so that children have their developmental and learning needs met, so that they're able to take up the kinds of lives that they would like to. And like many people who are working in the systems area, I started life as a social entrepreneur, and in that pursuit of impact have found myself in the systems space. And Liz, happy to drop into more detail later about the Front Project, but what we do is we're set up to we did some analysis around the systems, we did some mapping of the forces, the conditions that are being held in place, good things and bad things that help children and families, and then from there set up a series of initiatives. And so we would say that we are both a field catalyst, but also a capability specialist in early childhood education. And the kinds of initiatives we run are things like the APRI, which is a group of system leaders who we are helping build their collaborative muscle and their ability to work at a catalytic level, at a systems level. But we also have, you know, people who work very much in the research policy area, so meeting the needs of the system in that way. And then we also build out networks of people who are interested and able to advocate in terms of early childhood education. Shall I leave it there, Liz, or do you want me to keep going?
No, that's great, and we'll delve into that in a wee bit, but I'd just like to bring in Mark here. So Mark Steers from Sydney Policy Lab, over to you about what do you do and what kind of intermediary would you say you are?
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Jane, and wonderful, as everyone has said, to be here. Such an important conversation with a great group of people that you brought together. I'm coming from Gadigal land today, from Sydney, and as Jane said, also sending all solidarity to the good folks of Melbourne and around, and hoping that you're all dealing well with a really very, very difficult situation, and full of kind of strong senses of praise for the way everyone is responding. It's remarkable. So yeah, I'm here at a university. I'm actually in the university today. I'm on campus, and we are a university-based initiative. And I've spent most of my life in universities. And to answer Liz's question about what kind of intermediary we are, let me just start a little bit back in the mists of history. Sort of 20 odd years ago, when I was starting out in the UK, I was teaching at Cambridge University. And they set up something which we would now call an intermediary, which was called the Cambridge Programme for Industry, which was intended to enable collaboration between business groups, academics, and the critics of business groups. So the idea would be that you'd be able to get some sort of stronger sense of social commitment from businesses, some sort of, you know, what we now would call corporate social responsibility, I guess. It was just starting out back then. And as a very young academic, I started on a project bringing together BP, the oil company, with some of the big environmental groups, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace and the like, thinking about the way in which they might be able to transition the energy system away from hydrocarbons and towards a more sustainable future. You know, some of you will know it in a way that didn't end well. That program was BP went the opposite direction, but it was an amazing experience for me as a sort of 20-something to see just what was possible when you had an organization which was neutral in some sense, like a university. It was a place where all sorts of different people met from very different backgrounds, and where you could really help to facilitate different kinds of conversations than people have in their daily lives. And that's really what I've tried to do for the rest of my career, is to be a little bit more than an honest broker. I'm like committed to you know, provoking and challenging people as well, not just providing them with a space. But essentially being, you know, working with the assumption that when people collaborate across difference, real social change becomes possible. And here in the lab, the Sydney Policy Lab was set up a couple of years ago by the university in happier financial times when they still had money to spend. They've built us a beautiful building and given us a core staff. And our objective is to bring people together in discussion over the most complex policy challenges which face us, you know, environmental futures, the futures of social care, the possibilities that civil society organizations have to build their capability. And what we essentially do is facilitate, deepen the relationships between the partners that we think need to get to know each other better, so that they can really make change in those kind of areas. And so, you know, in pre-COVID times in our space here, we would often welcome groups of 50 or 60 people who had never met each other before, but all of whom are actually working within the same system or tackling the same problem. And we try to create sort of new and dynamic connections and relationships between them so they could begin to collaborate for change.
Great, thanks for that wonderful intro, Jane and Mark. It's really great to just, I guess, land the perspectives that we're all coming from. So you've both spoken to the current context, which is, you know, we've got COVID, we have a growing awareness around racial inequity, triggered by the US, but also catalyzing people here in Australia. But we've also got government in a kind of crisis response, and we've got vulnerable families on the ground trying to figure out, you know, how do we all get through this? So from your roles as intermediaries, what are you seeing? I guess we're interested in what are some of the patterns that you've seen playing out, the responses in terms of how people are responding and trying to collaborate through this. Who'd like to kick off?
I can do that. I'm happy to do that. And I feel in a slightly different position in early childhood education than some other areas. And I really, this came home to me yesterday when we were on a different webinar. So if I just go specific to early childhood education, then I'll come back out again. Early childhood education in the first phase of COVID went into crisis because the funding model for early childhood education is based on attendance, unlike, say, schools in later year education. And so parents quite understandably withdrew their children from early childhood education, which meant that all the different settings in which it's delivered, there's like 11 in Australia, all went into crisis, financial crisis, because they couldn't afford to run with the attendance drop. And so I am strangely and oddly grateful for the crisis in this moment, because what happened was the need to mobilise and to leverage all of the relationships that the Front project had set up suddenly came into fruition. And I do think our role as an intermediary really was made for those moments. So what we had was a group of sector leaders who were able to coalesce around the issue and problem, and we worked out a strategy forward. And we were able to work out who was going to take up what role in that moment. And what that meant was we were able to work with other organisations and some directly with federal government to help stabilise the sector. And then there opened a policy window, which meant we could iterate. So oddly, in this moment for early childhood education, there's actually an opportunity to iterate policy and funding flows. So for us in this moment, we had, both opportunity and constraints as well. But I don't think that's the same for every issue or sector, such as universities, for example, haven't quite got that policy window right now. And so there's a real diversity of experiences around social issues. So that's just one thing I wanted to flag, is that diversity of experiences. But one thing, Liz, I'm seeing around social issues is there is a little bit of a confusion around what's a campaign, a collaboration, a movement, and things are popping up. And it's quite absolutely right that in this moment we are galvanized to make change. Things have been laid bare in a way that is really clear and explicit. And then as things pop up, it's trying to assess whether they are truly collaborative moments or not. And it feels to me that people's different theories of change come to play. Like some people have quite a political theory of change, some people have a more movement building theory of change, others have a kind of collaborative one. And so for me, in that time when the childcare package was announced, I had within about 3 hours invitations to 6 different collaborations/campaigns, and trying to sort out what they were genuinely about and who to work with and all the rest of it became quite challenging at the time. So shall I leave it there so that Mark can reflect on what he's seeing?
Yeah, and can I just bring that thread in, Mark, that James introduced, which you spoke to earlier about when you bring difference together, change can happen. Could you pick that up and weave that into what you're saying about where you've seen that happen?
Yeah, I mean, great. I mean, I think basically one positive and one negative or more challenging story in that regard. I mean, the first thing, very much like James' sort of moment of policy opportunity, I think certainly in the early weeks of the pandemic, we found it much easier to get certain people together on a Zoom call like this one than it had ever been before. And most strikingly, we found it much easier to get senior level political buy-in to the conversations we were trying to facilitate, but also international participation. I was on some really staggeringly exciting calls in the first few weeks of the pandemic with folks especially from the UK and from the US, but also more broadly globally. And again, American and British philanthropists have played a phenomenally important role in that regard for us, in creating opportunities for us to share ideas with people that we wouldn't usually get to share ideas from. And that has been very generative, you know, lots of new partnerships, lots of new potential projects and campaigns, real collaborations, really, really exciting. And the very first piece of work we did in COVID was we put out just a 2-page sort of ethical statement of what we thought governments should do, which we co-designed with civil society organizations and with academics internationally, and the response we got from that was better than the response we've got from anything else. And you know, it's literally only 2 pages of 5 ideas, but because the ideas have been generated in that collaborative spirit, you know, with real energy and drive behind them, they really took off. So I think that's been fantastic. The more challenging issue, and Jane's already sort of highlighted it in a way, is that certainly in the later months of the pandemic, what we've noticed is the voices that we always kind of already struggle to hear, it's become even harder to hear. You know, so now I can have conversations with, you know, directors of really good civil society organizations, or, you know, senior academics or political leaders, and that's fantastic. It's great to have that. But I'm finding it increasingly difficult to hear what's actually happening on the ground for the kinds of communities that we're interested in working with and doing what we can to support. I've just come off a research project which is a Australia-wide collaboration looking at the experiences of autistic people during the COVID pandemic, and we'll try and publish that next week. But just to give people a sort of heads up of what it finds, are pretty awful findings, if I'm honest, of people who have just been totally abandoned by the system during this process. Not because of anyone's fault, but just because they've disappeared from the sorts of therapies they used to be accessing. They're not seeing their school teachers in the same way that they used to. The public facilities like libraries that they used to access, of course, have been closed. And no one's had a plan to be able to make sure that people are listening to those experiences and learning from them. My instinct, you know, my worrying hypothesis is that we're going to find much more of that in the weeks and months ahead. There'll be more and more groups of people that we suddenly think, oh, hold on a minute, we used to be in conversation with them, they used to be around the table, and they're not actually on the Zoom call, or we haven't heard from them for a while. And what are we going to do to make sure that, especially now with second lockdowns, etc., what are we going to make sure that doesn't get worse?
Mm. So there's an interesting theme emerging in what you're both saying, and I think it's something we've also observed in CFI, that we're really good generally at responding to crises where there's technical responses to maybe simple or complicated problems. And, you know, we've seen that internationally, that the leaders who've been elevated have been the ones who know intuitively that kind of direction that's needed in times of crisis. In a way, that's the easy work of leadership, is going, how do we react really quickly with what we know how to do and align with people that we didn't align with before? What I'm curious about, though, and you've both spoken to this, is that how quickly that snaps back. And the concern is that what we might be doing really well is programmatic responses, which are reinforcing status quo. And given all of our lenses are around how do we fundamentally change the conditions that keep those social problems in place, I'm curious about what you're seeing at the moment, or what you've experienced or involved in, but where there might be conditions which allow us in this time to really focus on shifting those conditions so that we don't revert back, and so that those people who are most vulnerable are part of it. And we're seeing how difficult that is. But I'm interested in where you're seeing that there's readiness or interest, or what's required. And I'll add another question. Where are you seeing it? Where is the readiness? But what is required of us as intermediaries, given there's a lot of intermediaries on this call? So think about what's our work then to make sure that we don't just go to the kind of default at this time. There's a nice meaty one. So Jane, over to you.
Yeah, just a small question. Liz, can I pick up something Mark said, which is a little bit related, Liz, to your question, thinking about the voices that aren't being heard and the experiences that aren't being elevated. In the group of leaders that we support in early childhood education, the APRI leaders, one of the most powerful things they did really address what you were talking about, Mark. So a group of them said, in this moment, children are not being heard. And what they need is not being heard. So what they did was, some of the leaders are pedagogical leads or teachers and so on. And so they worked directly with children to capture artwork and stories of their experience of COVID-19. And the themes that came out of that were just so grounding for this moment because there were things like the importance of connection and relationships, and how for them being in places that were safe were really important. And so what we were able to do with that was elevate that into, hey, when you, government, when you're thinking about policy and funding flows, we need to guarantee these things for children. Because for children, these are the most important things to help them navigate actually quite a confusing and complex space. So I just wanted to pick that up, Mark, because I think you're absolutely right in terms of who is and isn't being heard right now. Now, sorry, Liz, back to your question about where we see readiness. And I think that for us, we have seen readiness in some areas in early childhood education. It's a very complex system, and each segment of the system has experienced COVID-19 differently, and all kind of complex social issues would be like that. And what we have seen in some parts is a readiness to engage with empathy and understanding that someone else's experience is different. And that in fact, what we can do is hold that diversity of experiences and try to find a way through it in order to support each other. And then I've seen the opposite, a drive towards a very political response, and a response that is much more divisive and polarizing. So I have seen absolutely the mix. In terms of what is required, our role is to see the whole and to be able to work with all of the diversity of experiences in early childhood education, and to find a way of joining people up and helping them shape the kind of policy windows, if you like, that are open in early childhood education. The other issue is very much similar to what Mark raised before, is we now have groups of children who are no longer participating in early childhood education. And for some of the organisations in our network, that are large numbers, and they're children who may be experiencing vulnerability and disadvantage. And so that is absolutely something we need to pay attention to in the system.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, just really inspiring words. Thank you, Jane. I really want to again sort of underline that issue about polarization and where politics goes wrong. I really found in the opening weeks of the pandemic a great sense of hopefulness that politics as normal had gone away, and we had sort of disagreements and honest debate still, but you had bipartisanship and a willingness to try to experiment, try different things. You had across the world, apart from in the US, you had right-leaning governments implementing sort of economic stimulus projects that you wouldn't imagine them being ideologically well disposed to, but they did it because they needed to. But on the left also, you had a willingness to work with established authorities where they sometimes might have been more critical, and that was extraordinarily important. I am, worried that is drifting away, and again, the people in Victoria are closer to this than I am, but the debate over the second lockdown is so polarized and so focused, as always, on the personalities of particular politicians and party advantage on both sides. The Twitter arguments are so frantic and aggressive, and all of the subtlety and nuance, which I think an intermediary like us has to live with, is lost in that political moment. And that is something that we really need, from the Policy Lab's perspective, to campaign as hard as we can against. There are winners and losers to each and every policy move which is taken in a complex issue like COVID, and there simply isn't a straightforwardly good or a straightforwardly bad response in any individual instance. And our job, I think, is to try to get people to acknowledge that, both in private and in public, so that you can create more collaborative, more constructive and more creative responses to the situations we find ourselves in.
Mm. So this theme of polarities, I guess, is an interesting one, because it's it's something that we see obviously on complex issues, that when there's a disruption or the system's under threat, then people polarize. And we're seeing that increasingly. So I am interested in the role we play as intermediaries. Jane, you said, you know, our role is to provide the big picture. And doing that in a way that, you know, your description, Mark, of saying you're a bit more than an honest broker. There is a question about neutrality here, around what does it mean to be an honest broker as an intermediary and give a whole system view. And I know within CFI, we have very vigorous dialogue around what does neutrality look like when you are trying to catalyze the field and you are trying to shift conditions. However, you're also trying to give a more neutral view across it so that you can actually engage with the polarities rather than become one of them. So I'm interested in how you both grapple with that tension. It's a very real tension. And I'm sure others on this call are grappling with that too. So please, what's your wisdom?
I mean, I just think it's extreme. I mean, it's a brilliant question because it's so hard to answer. You know, it's like, it is the thing that we grapple with every day on every project, I think. It's like, you on the one hand, you want to give a lead sometimes because you think you've got access to information or insight that other people don't have that will change the nature of the debate, that will advance things. And on the other hand, you know that there's always a prejudice or a bias to every piece of information that you want to share. You know, and I have a background, some folks will know, in sort of left-wing politics. I used to be a Labour Party sort of operative back in the UK. And so my natural predisposition leans in one direction rather than another. And that can be problematic when you're trying to, you know, broker these conversations, facilitate these conversations. I mean, the answer I always come back to at the end of the day, at the moment, although I'm open to new ones, is, you know, I learned my trade really from the Industrial Areas Foundation in the United States. And they make this distinction between what they call organizers and what they call leaders. And they say the job of a backbone organization or an intermediary is to be an organizer and not to be a leader. So you facilitate leadership from others and support the leadership of others and build capability for leadership. But you should always think of yourself as not actually the leader yourself, but you're the organizer. And an organizer in their language is more than just a broker. You know, it's someone who shapes a debate, who holds a space, who sets an agenda. You know, so you're out there a little bit more than just somebody who's, you know, sort of convening. But what you're not trying to do is to play the leading role. You're trying to support those who can play that leading role. And that you know, that, I mean, obviously it'd take longer to talk about that distinction in more depth, but that's what I generally try to hang on to remind myself that you're not trying to lead here, that you're trying to organize.
Jane.
Yeah, so I feel I feel quite conflicted on this one. So I don't think there's any such thing as a neutral player, right? And I think we can't set it up in that way. And what I've experienced at the Front project, and it could explain why we're all tired, is actually we hold attention. So part of our activities in systems change is absolutely about leading from within and building those group of people at all different points in the system to be able to input and shape and take up roles. And in that sense, we are not out front, if you like, Mark. You know, we're within and facilitating and equipping people, and you know, we supported people who negotiated with government and all the rest of it. That was our role at that time. And then at other times, we've taken a more leadership role. And so in that moment of the crisis, wrongly or rightly, we had to decide on our strategy. And so we went two-pronged. We went to support the sector, build capacity, help them do what needs to be done. But we also ourselves put together information for government that said, here are all the choices you could have in this moment to fund this system. Here are some criteria we think are really important. In this moment, pragmatically, contextually, we would say these were the criteria you need to apply, and therefore here is what we're recommending. we did that off the back of working with a whole group of people, but in that moment we led that piece. And so I don't know if that makes me just really terrible at being an intermediary, or in that moment we had to intentionally take up a role because the moment demanded something different of us than sitting behind the scenes. And it might be contextual, because for early childhood education providers or leaders, people working in that area, they come from one segment. And so they come with a perception of a vested interest. There wasn't a lot of independent people who had an overview. And so in that moment, we intentionally took up a slightly different role.
So I just want to build on that, and I can see Moira's coming in. I'll flick over to her, but I think what you've both brought in has raised some interesting questions. In CFI, we would work with a definition of leadership slightly different, Mark, which is around comes from adaptive leadership, that everybody can exercise leadership but take up different roles in that. So taking up a role of authority and taking direction on it because you were authorized, or leading in a way which you are enabling people to face a new reality. And I think that's where, as an intermediary's role, there's that interesting tension. How we navigate it is really about seeing that there is a role to play of being the honest broker to convene others, but at the same time having a vantage and a lens on what's happening across the field, and being able to use the authority that we've got along with others to get attention on that issue. But all of it would be in relation to what does it mean to work systemically, as opposed to having a view on that beyond the kind of core principles around system change, one of which is you've got to ensure that the people most impacted are involved in the dialogue. So we could totally get behind what you were saying, Mark, around how do we make sure those with a lived experience are involved in it, regardless of the issue you're working on. But I think the tensions there are very real when we're working towards social change and seeing things in the polarities which are fundamentally going against that. And I wonder if that's where there's actually collaborative opportunity across the field as a whole, so we're not one voice doing it. And Moira, I'm getting the nod from you, so I'm going to link to you now to bring in what are the questions people are coming up with.
Thanks, Liz. So just building on what you've just been saying, really, somebody would like to know more about the language, right? The ways in which you're communicating and sending messages that don't polarize people more in these times. And given both Jane and Mark and you, Liz, have all given different examples of how that happens, people would love to know a little bit more about the way to the language and how to communicate and send those messages.
Great question. Who'd like to kick off?
Well, two quick reflections. It is a really important question. I mean, the first thing is I'd just say it's really hard because what we unfortunately know from the science of rhetoric is like polarization works. That's why people do it. And that's why Twitter is such a bad thing, because like it makes people do it even more. The only way that you get a response is by being as polarizing as you possibly can. And you get thousands of people engaged with you if you take a dramatic sort of perspective on something. So it's really hard to do communications work which is effective, which has cut through, which excites people, gets people going, but isn't polarizing. So that's the kind of first thought. But it is possible, is the second thought. That's the more optimistic note, is that you can galvanize people in ways which are not sort of polarizing. And the person I worked with in my career who's best at this is a man called David Axelrod in the United States, who was Barack Obama's sort of campaign manager and sort of speechwriter and supporter in the early days. And Axelrod, I got to work with when I was working for the Labour Party, and he has very many rules, but one of his rules, which I love, is like, if you're ever tempted to write as if it's a comic book or as if you're a superhero, like, stop. So you're never the solution to a problem. Like, you might, and this comes back to our conversation just now, you might be part of the solution to a problem, and you can say that, but you've always got to be inviting other people to join you to be part of a collective solution. And so, some of us will remember that from the early exciting Obama years, back in the 2008 period or whatever, is that he really used to get people excited, not by giving them answers, but by inviting them to be part of the solution and saying, look, what we can do together is stronger than what we can do separately. And I'm not going to pretend as if I've got all the solutions here. I'm not going to pretend it happens by demonizing my opponent. I'm just going to create a dynamic and exciting space that you can be part of. So, what I try and do, what we try and do at the lab always, is trying to make that language as exciting as we possibly can, and as inviting and as friendly and as warm as we possibly can, because I think that's the kind of crucial component to it all.
Great. And Moira's just put that link in as well to David Axel, so thanks for that. Jane?
Yeah, so the way we handle that similar, we have a meta-narrative that is embracing, and it's people can find themselves in a meta-narrative, and for us that's about families and children. And then because we work with a lot of different stakeholders, we work closely with a group of business network leaders and a network of business leaders who I think in this time, the marrying together of social and economic issues and the understanding that they're two sides of a coin, if you like, I think is absolutely present in a way that I think hasn't been before. And so for us, we would then talk to each of those stakeholder groups, audiences, this is what you can do in this moment. So Mark, as you're saying, that they see themselves as part of the solution, but they are a part. It relies on all of us working together to achieve something. For us, it's about children, but for whatever the issue might be. And I agree, it's easy to get into polarizing. It's easy to get into fear. But I'm definitely more on the here's our opportunity, here's our hope, here's what we can do, end of the spectrum. But certainly we spend a lot of time on narratives and framing, because they go to the heart of the mental models that we all carry, and they are the things that often keep issues in place in Australia. So we spend a lot of time in that space.
So speaking to the mental models part, I think is really important. So to take an adaptive lens on it, I think what we would be doing when we're working with collaborations and looking at how do we align those polarizing views is to look at what that galvanizing, is there a galvanizing shared purpose that actually people want the same outcome, but they've got very different ways of going about doing it, and to anchor people in that we're all working towards the solution. But being able to, I'm really interested in how we engage with the other. That I don't think generally we're very good at doing that, that it's much easier to polarize. And I would say, to own, coming from the social sector, we can often sit on the moral high ground a bit and go, we've got right on our side and it's the others who need to shift. So that piece about seeing ourselves in it, but being able to speak to, what is it that they fear is at stake? What is it, the potential loss for the other that they are going to hold on really tightly to? And in fact, the more that gets attacked, the more they're going to hold on to it. That I think the more we can show, or that we understand what that is, what is at stake, what is it people fear they may lose if they engage in this change, and what is the value that they are really trying to espouse. It may not, the way they're going about it or the approach that they take may not be one we're aligned with, but we can actually see that what they're advocating for is something we would all say is a noble value, if you like. And I think that's really hard to do when it's much easier to pit ourselves against the other. And even if we won't come along with that approach, being able to say, I understand what we're asking, what this change is asking of you, but can we align around it? Like in COVID, give up our freedoms, having to wear masks, having to, whatever it might be, we might think, people need to get over themselves, but actually there's something they really want to be heard. And I think, the more we can find ways to do that, interpersonally, but also systemically, we've seen that can nudge people in the right direction. So building on that, I want to kind of hone into you a wee bit here. We've gone outwards to go, what are we seeing out there? And I'm interested in your roles as intermediaries through all of this, what have you had to shift in the way that you're working? What have you had to maybe embrace that you've been reluctant to before? And what's the learning been for you in that? What's stuck with you about something you might have to do differently ongoing from here on? What comes to mind?
I can kick it off. I mean, this has been an extraordinary time for early childhood education. And at a personal and organisational level, it's exposed our biases, actually. So, Liz, to your point about sitting with and understanding the perspectives of people that you don't normally, I absolutely agree with. And I think moral righteousness is not a strategy. And it's an energy, but it's not a strategy, and it polarizes people. And I'm really worried that we are flipping back into that at the moment. It's almost like when Trump was elected president, there was this incredible polarizing that enabled that to happen. And that is slightly my fear in this moment, that we will do that. But going back to what you were saying, we really learnt that there are segments in early childhood education who I may have been in the past a little bit dismissive of. Actually, the complexity or the diversity is also a strength in our sector. There are families who need different things, actually, and I came to appreciate the role that they play in families' lives and children's lives in a different way. And it became much more about, okay, so how do we raise the pedagogy and the practice across the board for everyone? One segment isn't any better than any other, in the sense what that doesn't play to actually what we want for children. So there was a learning for us around that. And for us, it was about acknowledging those who wanted to play a more kind of vicious game, if you like, in the media, and a takedown game, and refusing to participate in that. So that was a learning for us, you know, and there have been many more. The other one we found is that in moments of crisis, your capacity to respond is built in the peacetime. Almost, you know, those relationships, the capability and so on. So that's why it's so important. And we hadn't quite realised that, of course, it comes to play in the crisis point, and that's why you invest very much. And then the other one that we found in terms of our learning was sense making together actually helped us work out the next steps. So again, those diversities of views and listening to all the data points and the feedback from the system and making sense together actually became really critical for us.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, just two quick reflections, again, very similar. I mean, I think two things we've struggled with, one of which is how do you confront moral righteousness? Because I think, Liz, you've really put your finger on something there. The sector as a whole can fall back into moral righteousness very easily. Look, I'll be totally honest, in academia, it's 10 times worse. I mean, like, academia begins from moral righteousness. Like, people think that, you know, everybody else who's gone to work in the private sector when they're in their early 20s has done some horrible pact with the devil. I've stayed pure because I've stayed in the academy and I'm reading books, you know. And we are, you know, we're based and funded by a university, and we are, I think, in a very difficult situation then, because when we haven't worked out a way of dealing with that, if I'm honest. Like, I totally think the response to the COVID situation is to avoid moral righteousness, to listen to multiple perspectives, to build bipartisanship. But I know when I say that to my colleagues on campus, they think I'm a sort of right-wing sellout. And that is a challenge, you know, and how we deal with that our commitment to, as again, back to our earlier conversation, more than an honest broker, but being open to multiple perspectives, it's really important to us. But it is it's not in place with the culture of, you know, of campus life. That's the first one. I think the second one is, how do we keep place going at a time of placeless digital communication? I think, you know, on the one hand, as I said at the start, I've been so excited by the international collaborations I've been able to have over the last few months. Been wonderful, and I've just been invited to lead a course at Harvard next year, and that's really exciting. And, you know, on the other hand, it takes us away from what we know, which is that your place is fundamental to how you run a genuinely collaborative sort of intermediary. You know, I want to be of Sydney, not sort of floating above the world in Zoom land. But how do you do that when you're not doing things face to face, and when you've got all these exciting international opportunities? Again, I haven't worked out how you reconcile those two tendencies.
Great, thank you. Moira, we got another question.
Yeah, we've got a couple here, so I'll pop them together because we're coming to the end of our time. And maybe you can take one each, or I'll leave it with you, Liz, to distribute the questions. The first one's about, you know, is it okay to move forward with those who are already on board and not have to spend the time and energy trying to get others on board who might have perspectives outside the majority? And that was a question that was also being brought up in other webinars we've had in this series. And then the second one's around processes and tools. You know, what are the ones that you're finding most helpful around sense making, particularly when there's diverse views and perspectives?
Lovely. Okay, thank you. So, Jane, do you want to kick off about who do you start with? How do you bring others along if there's not readiness?
I do think understanding preconditions for readiness is actually really important. And are they in place? Because there is no point in trying to work away if you've got no energy around what you're trying to do, or even awareness or any of those things. So there's definitely, I think, a sense of understanding what are the preconditions that are needed in place. And then, Liz, can you remind me the question again? Sorry.
Bringing others along. What do you spend time bringing people along who aren't ready? And also tools and resources was part of the question to help make sense of that.
Yeah. In terms of more movement building and bringing people on, you know, the research that resonates with me from my experience is that you've got a whole lot of people who are going to come with you no matter what. They're going to love you, and you've got to pay attention to them so they stay with you. You have a whole bunch of people that are never ever going to come with you, and that's okay. Let's not try and convert them. And then you got a bunch of people in the middle who sit on the fence, who are not really sure. Doesn't mean to say they don't agree with you, but they need to see themselves in it or understand what it means. And so that's the group we focus on. And we keep our, you know, supporters and everything in tight as well. So that's how we approach it. And then in terms of tools, we use a lot of the adaptive leadership ways of working. And just say, as a practical example, our team every day, although we'll move to every second day very soon, sits there and brings insights from the system. Oh, I had this conversation and so-and-so has told me this is happening. And then what we do is take those insights, and sometimes we'll work through a process where we say, there could be actually 10 reasons why that could be happening. What could they be? Because otherwise we can get trapped in our own way of thinking about something where you go, oh, that's that. Let's move on. But actually trying to understand the data or the pieces of information that are coming in through our networks and you know, different organizations we're collaborating with. What does this mean for us in this moment? Do we need to change something that we are doing? One of the things this time has given me is a deep appreciation of the loss and grief you can feel. And so if I'm asking someone else to go through that pain, I need to understand it and acknowledge it as well, and that it shows up in different kinds of ways. So anyway, we use a lot of the adaptive leadership tools.
Great. Mark.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, same as Jane on the first one. I mean, definitely don't worry about the people you're never ever going to get. But on the other hand, don't make yourself feel good just by talking to the people you already have. So, like, you know, the real challenge is that middle group, and it's the same, I think, in party politics. Actually, I mean, that's the way you win elections. So, it's the same in this kind of work. I mean, in terms of tools, you know, the one that we use in the lab more than any, again, comes from the Industrial Areas Foundation. It's what we call the Relational Method, which is this very straightforward idea that human relationships precede planning or action or policy. So don't have the conversation about the strategy or the outcome first, have the conversation about the relationship and get into relationship. And that, you know, involves, you know, we train all of our team in that method, which involves people sharing much more about their personal lives than they usually would do, in finding connections with people across difference, in ways which have nothing to do with policy or ideology or technicality, but everything to do about shared experience and shared outlooks. I mean, that has been transformative to me. I was taught that method by Arnie Graf, former sort of co-director of the Industrial Areas Foundation 10 years ago, and it has changed my life. And it's just a profound way of working. It's slower, harder, can be challenging, but it really creates, you know, strong collaborations with people that you otherwise wouldn't imagine that you could collaborate with.
Great. Just to add in, as we're coming to the end of time, just some other resources. Moira's put in the chat the link to Platform C. So Platform C has a whole phase on how do you build readiness, how do you look at where there might be early adopters or innovators and start with the low-hanging fruit, but also have an eye on the early minority that are the early majority that are emerging, and have different approaches for that. I think there's something in what you've both said, and sorry, just on that, jump on there, there's loads of tools, resources that you can download and use. I think there's something really important that you've both spoken to about starting with the relationships, but also being willing to test your own interpretations. That, you know, your check-in, Jane's a lovely example of, we can bring in observations, but we often hold them as truth, as opposed to going, okay, what's a range of interpretations? What might be a systemic interpretation of what's going on, or an adaptive interpretation that might open up the possibilities so that we don't react from our usual interpretations of things. And Mark, you saying, you know, that reminder that we should be speaking to unusual suspects and not just those who do like and agree with us, and hearing a range of options and interpretations on what they bring. I think this work of readiness and building preconditions is critical on systems change. And I'm also really interested, though, in how we create spaces where we can bring the polarities together, knowing that we've got to engage with the other in some way and the other voice. And I guess for other intermediaries out there, really interested and continue to explore that space. Because whether we do that on a personal level or a system level, at the end of the day, it's the other view we've got to try and bring along as intermediaries. So I want to just thank you both. I'm going to hand over to Moira in a second, but thanks for what's been a great conversation. I'm sure we could have carried on for another hour. Thank you.